Welcome to the April 2025 edition of the Slingshot. Today's special guest is John Newman, professor of law at the University of Miami Law School, where he teaches antitrust law. Now, John recently left the Federal Trade Commission, where he served under Lena Khan as deputy director of the Bureau of Competition. John's an assistant editor of the Antitrust Law Journal, and he's the author of several law review articles, including The Output Welfare Fallacy, a Modern Antitrust Paradox, which we will discuss today. And here's a little known fact about John. He served as research assistant to Herb Hovenkamp, with whom he now spars on Twitter over arcane antitrust topics. Welcome, John, to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Hal.
Yeah. And let me also introduce my friend and Slingshot partner in crime, Darren Bush, who teaches antitrust law at the University of Houston and is currently trapped inside of a Facebook entertainment walled garden. Darren, can you hear us from down there?
Yes, indeed. And as usual, my background hasn't been fixed yet, so I will appear pink, like the communist many people think I am.
Well, shut down your Facebook apps so that we can have this conversation today. And our big topic is, I think, the hottest topic in antitrust right now, and that's the FTC's challenge of Facebook's acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp, which the agency approved several years ago before antitrust enforcement was a thing. So, John, let's jump in here. But before we do, let's just make a few disclosures. I'm going to go first. I was the FTC's expert in a case challenging Facebook's acquisition of Within. The FTC, of course, prevailed on market definition in that case, but lost on anti-competitive effects. John, why don't you go next? Any disclosures?
Yeah, I should say that I was at the FTC and oversaw this case that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, the FTC v. Meta case, and oversaw another case against Meta, the same one that Hal just mentioned. Of course, anything I say will be just my thoughts, not those of the FTC, certainly, and it won't reveal or draw on any privileged or confidential information.
Okay, great. Well, most antitrust conversations begin with market definition. But of course, this is my show, and we're actually going to start with something that's more important, which is anti-competitive effects. So, John, what I want to know is which parties suffered antitrust injury from Facebook's acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp, and what was the nature of their harm?
So you can't say this about most antitrust cases, but I think in this particular case, the people who've suffered harm are just about everybody on Earth. Certainly just about everybody in the US. I think in the first instance, it's users of personal social media platforms. I think there's also knock-on effects on competition more broadly. I think certainly there's part of the case that the judge already got rid of that involved harm to some small startups, that sort of thing. But at this point, I think the primary harmed individuals are us. And so what kind of harms are we talking about here? I think there's a couple. Let's maybe start with the more tangible ones. Higher ad loads. All right, what does that mean? Basically, Meta is jamming more ads down our eyeballs, letting us see less of the content that we actually want to see. And then second, I think another really tangible direct harm here is degraded user privacy. So we know that Meta has started out pitching itself to users as a privacy protecting platform, and over time that has gone by the wayside. I'm pausing for just a second. People have kind of derided these. I think Meta's counsel said, who really cares if you have to spend 1 extra second scrolling past an ad? I think I would push back on that and say, well, for one thing, it's hundreds of millions of users. It's billions of ads. It's not 1 second, right? We're talking years of our lives collectively spent viewing things we don't want to see instead of the things we really want to see. I think that really matters. And I would say that, that's our time, that's our attention. That matters more than anything, right? I think time is the one thing money can't buy. So I think it's a direct harm. It's pretty tangible, and it's pretty important as well.
All right, that's very helpful. Now, my follow-on question before I turn it over to Darren is, how do you think the FTC is planning to show the anti-competitive effects here? And I presume they've hired a fancy economist to bring forward some model. But do you have any insight as to who it is and what she or he is planning to do?
Yeah, we have some sense now that the trial has started. what the FTC is planning to do in terms of trial strategy. It looks like they've hired a couple of different experts, but Scott Hemphill is going to be, it sounds like, their primary economist. And Scott's got a bunch of data that he's clearly been working with. And he's going to show a couple different things. I think one, he's going to show that the ad load, so that's the ratio of advertisements to content we actually want to see, has been going up over time. I think that's important. He's not just going to show that the number of ads is going up. He's going to actually show that that ratio has been trending up. Think of it kind of like a take rate in another antitrust case. So that's going to be big. I think he's also got some natural experiments that he's going to, it sounds like, work with. For instance, he's got data on what happened after the Cambridge Analytica scandal hit the newswires. If a company didn't have market power, you'd probably expect a bunch of users to flee that platform once they found out what had been happening with their privacy. And I think he's going to be able to show that that didn't happen, suggesting that Meta actually wields quite a bit of market power over users. I think that's a couple of big things. You know, he's also, I think, interestingly, it sounds like, although this part was mostly redacted out of the opening statement for the government, it sounds like he's going to try to show that Meta price discriminates, and I'm using air quotes around price there, but basically gets a sense for which users are especially stuck on the platform and jams even more advertisements down their eyeballs. And I think that's also going to be a pretty, hopefully, powerful piece of evidence here.
Okay. Well, let's talk about some competition versus time tax. So I think I forwarded this to you. Anton Dinev, Director of Global Partnerships and Assistant Professor EU and Competition Law at Northeastern University of London. That's a long title. Had a tweet, and it said, "I like the idea of a time tax," which brings me back to a Twitter discussion I had 5 to 6 years ago with John Newman as to whether attention user time is paid as a price paid by consumers or product output produced by consumers. So he says, this quote seems to support my view of attention as a price or time tax, but the remainder of what is being asserted is in this quote depends on whether or not TikTok is an actual or potential competitor. Many Facebook users would say that while they are no longer using the platform to stay in touch with friends and family, they tend to spend more and more time watching real short videos, which Facebook introduced in response to TikTok. So competition, actual or potential, seems to be key to deciding whether the same or lower friend and family shared time on Facebook has been offset by paying a time tax for higher ad load or watching more reels as a result of competition from TikTok. So which is it, John?
Well, I'm tempted to refer to the famous Taco Bell commercial from the 90s, or why not both? But let's start with the time tax idea, which I do like. That's a nice kind of catchy way to refer to this idea. So I think Anton, I mean, he totally caused me to have a flashback to like pre-pandemic discussions of this stuff, which is a reminder that this case has been going on for quite a while. Uh, but I think attention is both something that we pay to use these services, right? Very literally, we pay attention to use these things. So it is like a currency in a sense. It's kind of like money. It's kind of like paying a tax, but it is also a product that we produce. It's like labor in a sense, right? Because this attention that we give to Facebook is not something that then just floats away into the ether. They've got the product and now they can resell the product to an advertiser. That's how they make their money. So it really is both. It is both the currency that we pay in and also something that we produce, kind of like a worker produces their labor. As to the TikTok question, yeah, you can kind of think of this a couple different ways, but the way I like to think of it is it does seem pretty clear that Meta introduced Reels in part as a response to users jumping onto TikTok and watching short form video content. You could either view that, and I think some people view it as, oh my gosh, here's evidence that we've got a new entrant that's totally disrupting competition, and that must mean that Facebook doesn't have a monopoly anymore. In other words, you could view it as a breach of the castle walls. Or you can view it as the king in their castle seeing something going on outside the castle that they don't like and sending an army out and assaulting that threat. And that's kind of how I tend to think of this. When when you look at the way that Facebook's behaved over time, there's a clear pattern, right? They see a threat and they take anti-competitive steps to either buy or bury it, as Lena Khan has said, quite memorably. And I think that's what happened here. So I don't view this as, okay, now we don't have a monopoly anymore. I view it as, yeah, we're pivoting to expand our reach even further.
Got it. Well, let me ask you this, John. We've now gotten a full week of the trial. This is the second week. I think we're recording this on Tuesday, and I'm curious. You've been paying attention, Twitter and other coverage. I'm curious. What do you think is the biggest surprise? What was the biggest surprise the first week?
I'm going to answer this very carefully as somebody who saw at least some of the evidence, of course, that the FTC is going to present while I was at the agency. So I'm going to answer this as a hypothetical me who hadn't been at the agency, just sitting here on the outside. I think the biggest surprise there have been a number of them, but the biggest one may have been the line in Mark Zuckerberg's email in 2018, I think it was, where he said, you know what, should we just think about breaking ourselves up? I think that would actually probably free us up to do strategy better. We wouldn't have this built-in conflict of interest where we have to hobble all of our services so they don't compete on each other's turf. It could unlock some value, right? So it would remove what he called the strategic tax. Right now, we can't do the full range of strategies because we have these conflicts of interest. And then he talked about how companies, he said, most people don't realize this, but companies usually actually do better after they're broken up. He's talking about, I take it, literature showing that corporate spinoffs often unlock value, right? Increase share prices, and allow companies to, as he said, perform better. I think that landed with a pretty big splash, because that's just not how lay people are used to thinking about these companies. They fight tooth and nail in court to avoid even the hint of a breakup. And here's the CEO internally saying, like, actually, I think a breakup would probably be better, as I take it, for our shareholders, for the people who use our services, right? That's pretty huge. And I think that's got to loom large in the judge's mind as this goes forward.
Yeah, especially for remedies. Let me ask you another question too. I saw some coverage that seemed to suggest that Sheryl Sandberg was helpful to the FTC's case, noting that she confirmed how Facebook was willing to block advertisements, say, from potential competitors to Facebook. Curious, do you agree with that? How do you think her testimony came off? Was she helpful to the FTC's case?
It sounds like she was. I'm going to admit some extra bias here. My good friend Susan Musser took that witness at trial, and it sounds like Susan did her usual bang-up job. Susan's great. She, I think, usually comes across in court really well, and it sounds like she had a really nice rapport with the witness. They were, not adverse at all, it sounded like. Susan was asking straight-ahead, direct questions. Sheryl was giving, for the most part, pretty direct, clear answers. And for the most part, that helped the FTC's case. It sounds like behind the scenes, there's been a little bit of a falling out of late between Sheryl and Mark. I think Mark's kind of been throwing her under the bus on Capitol Hill, saying, oh, all that woke stuff we were doing, that was Sheryl's fault. That wasn't me. So it may be that there's a little bit of bad blood under the surface here, but that, set all that aside, I think it sounds like what she said in court was pretty clear. And mostly lined up with the way the FTC thinks about this case. Yeah, there's, in a sense, competition from all over the place, but the closest competitive set does not include everybody.
So I have a couple of questions about these hot documents, these smoking gun emails about that Zuckerberg wrote about the threat of Instagram. And I seem to recall in Instagram and in the subsequent WhatsApp deal a second request being issued, and I would imagine those documents existed at that time. So gosh, you would think that there would have been a challenge back then. What happened? Someone get sloppy in doc review or what?
It's easy, I think, sitting on the outside of the agency to kind of lob stones at that, especially the Instagram deal back in 2012, where this wasn't even a threat of potential competition, right? It's pretty clear Zuckerberg saw Instagram as an existing competitor that was gaining traction quickly. It's pretty easy to second guess that one. And I'm going to say this as somebody who did call that deal anti-competitive pretty early on. I think 2014 was the first paper I wrote that in. You got to put yourself back in the mindset of somebody in 2012 to be fair to these regulators. Facebook was big, was dominant already, but they had surpassed MySpace, only 4 years before at that point. The vibes in antitrust land were much different than they are now. There was very much a vibe of, hey, let's just kind of let the market take care of itself. We've just seen creative destruction not too long ago. Surely that will happen again. So, to be fair, it was a different environment for regulators. You had different leadership in place. You had a bunch of economists all saying, yeah, these markets, I mean, there were still people saying antitrust doesn't even apply when you don't have a price at play, right? Fundamental questions were still unsettled. So that's to be fair, the world was very different back then. You could maybe kind of see, if you squint a little bit, how regulators would have let this one go. And maybe they thought, we'll catch it down the road if it turns out to be anti-competitive. Well, here we are. Took a while, but here we are.
Yeah, we didn't know anything about zero price markets from, internet browsers in the 90s or anything like that. So,
Yeah.
so
That
I
was maybe a
totally
little
get
too
that.
fair. I don't know.
So,
Well, let's shift over to market definition, because I mean it always does raise its ugly head. But the FTC asserts a relevant market of personal social networking, and Facebook's defenders insist that Facebook competes against firms like LinkedIn and Twitter. I can't bring myself to say X, sorry. But can they both be right? In other words, can it be the case that Facebook weakly competes against apps outside of personal social networking, while personal social networking still constitutes a relevant antitrust market? Explain this for those who are not schooled in the arts of antitrust, John.
Yes, the answer is yes, absolutely. And it's been, I think, one of the more frustrating parts of the public discourse surrounding this case to watch as an antitrust expert, like you or Darren, and I'll weekly include myself in that group as well. The idea of an antitrust relevant market is to capture the group of sales, paraphrasing just a little bit, but that really closely constrain each other, right? It's not an attempt to, and you're not supposed to, loop in everybody with whom the defendant kind of competes. So it can absolutely be true that in a sense, yeah, Facebook does compete with YouTube or with anybody who's trying to get your eyeballs, right? That's true in a sense. But it's also, I think, true, and certainly can be true, that those companies, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, et cetera, they don't have to be in the same antitrust relevant market as Facebook and Instagram. So yeah, they probably weekly compete the same way that coffee competes with beer, right? Those are all in some kind of beverage market, probably. But that doesn't mean they have to be in the same relevant market in an antitrust case.
Okay. Now, Facebook's defenders, and I'll point out this was an economist leader from this week, notes they like to point to TikTok as evidence of low entry barriers, suggesting that Facebook's market power, if anything, is fleeting or has been eviscerated. Now, what would you say to something like that?
I mean, we might start with what TikTok has said. Apparently, they got up in court and said, no, we don't view ourselves as in that same narrow set. So let's start with their own view. But I would say, look, on the outside looking in, even if you assume that TikTok is in this relevant market, right? Personal social networking, I don't think that's right. But even if you granted that, I mean, look at the highly unusual, unique conditions that all had to be in place before TikTok could enter that market. And again, I don't think they are in the market, but let's assume. Okay, so TikTok, wasn't able to enter for several years after the, Instagram acquisition. We know that TikTok was able to spin up its own critical mass of users, and that's essential in these markets, right? Because you know that scale is really important. There's network effects, all that. TikTok was able to spin up its own user base in a very unique environment, basically in China, right? Well, in China, users aren't legally allowed to use Facebook or Instagram. So TikTok has this perfect little playground insulated from the giants, Facebook, Instagram, where it's able to, uniquely, artificially, free from competition, spin up its own user base. And even then, right? So you've got 1 billion potential users that are totally yours to play with. You're totally protected from competition. Even then, TikTok still has to make $1 billion acquisition of Musical.ly to get access to what, like 80 million US users. And that's the only way it gets its foothold in the US. And then eventually, between the 1 billion Chinese users and the 80 million US users it's had access to, eventually able to enter. That's a pretty wild story, right? That's not a highly competitive market where it's super easy to enter. That's one company after years finally cracks the code, given some really unique barriers to entry of its own and $1 billion acquisition.
Yeah, you anticipated my next question, so I'm gonna alter it a bit, because you point out correctly that even if you accept that TikTok has entered in the same market, it took something like 6 odd years until after the Facebook acquisition of Instagram. So clearly, TikTok could not have helped or protected any user from anti-competitive injury in that 6-year period. But you've already anticipated that one, so I want to alter the question a bit. I looked at what the FTC said in its briefing, and they noted that even if you do ultimately have entry, right, that doesn't mean there were no entry barriers. I think, as you just pointed out, right, there were considerable entry barriers that TikTok had to overcome. So the mere existence of entry doesn't disprove entry barriers. And entry barriers is really the only thing that has to be shown. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. We talk about barriers to entry. We don't mean it's literally impossible to enter, right? There's been hundreds of monopolization cases where a court said, yes, there are barriers to entry here. In none of them was it literally impossible to enter, right? All we mean by entry barriers are things that make it hard to enter. And I think, if anything, if you're viewing it through that lens, the fact that there's only been one company everybody's pointing to as even a possible entrant here, that kind of tends to confirm that it is really hard to enter, and it doesn't disprove that there are barriers at all.
Yeah, and perhaps this is me just trying to arrive at some sort of consistent antitrust enforcement policy despite changes and shifts in political wills. But it seems to me there's a fundamental problem with how we view companies like Facebook. And so if you go back and you look from 2007 to 2018, so they acquire or attempt to acquire more than 100 companies in competing in adjacent markets. And some of those acquisitions transferred key technology and expertise to in terms of app development platforms, instant messaging, photo sharing, location services, right? Some of those acquisitions killed interoperability and converted those to Facebook exclusive features. And some of those acquisitions were simply shuttered, just gone. And it seemed that during that time period, that at least in the like in the UK, for example, they said that Instagram was a current competitor to Facebook. You seem to agree with that, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth and all that. Uh, and so there seems to be this problem of how to halt that sort of the start of a monopoly at the outset. So, all right, we get to this point where we have this company that's this giant, but when it's starting to defend itself by those acquisitions, we really don't have many tools to deal with that. Isn't that why we get to this hand wringing about market definition in the first place, and that there's really no good antitrust tools in the ex ante world? Isn't that kind of what Meta Within teaches us, that there's you just can't stop them with the current antitrust law as it is?
Well, I certainly wish we would have won on all fronts in meta within. We won on the motion to dismiss, as Hal pointed out at the outset. We won on market definition. I think we got some really good law on the books. At the end of the day, though, you're right that the judge let that deal go through. And I think you're also right to point out that that we've just doing things ex post is clearly not the answer either. I mean, this case that we're talking about primarily today is an ex post merger case now. It's just Instagram and WhatsApp. But that's what, 2 out of hundreds of acquisitions? You tell me those are the only 2 anti-competitive ones? Man, even the complaint in this case gets close to saying the Onavo acquisition was anti-competitive. So yeah, in this case, which just goes after 2 mergers, has now taken what, 5 years, right? That's a long time. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, that's a lot of agency resources devoted to this one cleanup case. So I don't think ex post is the answer, but I don't think it's impossible to win these ex ante cases. I think Meta Within was kind of unique in the sense that it was the first time any US regulator had tried to block a big tech deal ex ante. And I think that just creates a whole bunch of like political and just real world headwinds that once you've kind of thrown that first rock, and it almost broke through, it didn't quite, but it cracked the wall. And once you've thrown the first rock, the next one gets easier to throw, and that one can break through. And so I kind of view that case as the start of something.
Yeah, I don't disagree. You guys got some lovely parting gifts in Meta Within. You got some lovely consolation prizes. But the fact of the matter is, you're right. There's hundreds of acquisitions, and there is harm that occurs from monopolization that would not have occurred if those mergers were challenged in the first instance. And it seems like judicial education about antitrust law still favors those type 1 error kind of considerations. And
Yeah.
that might be a problem.
I think that is right. That's still the water that we swim in, unfortunately. I will say, if I can do a little shameless self-promotion, Becca Slaughter and Bob Land and I have an article on the second prong of Clayton Act Section 7, the tend to create a monopoly prong. I actually think that is an unused tool. It's not even underused. It's like unused, basically. That might be a better fit for this type of acquisition than the substantially lessened competition. I think that's where people sometimes get hung up when they're running these ex ante analyses of a acquisition of a little target firm. Well, does that really substantially lessen competition? Hard to say. Does it tend to create a monopoly? I think almost certainly in a lot of cases. So there may be tools that we haven't fully used yet.
Well, let's shift topics to our last topic. This is your paper on the output welfare fallacy. Just before we get into it and see how it applies to the current challenge of Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, I'm wondering if you can just help define the output welfare fallacy for our listeners and maybe give us an example just to crystallize the idea.
Yeah, so it's one of the odd facets of antitrust discourse that the biggest critique of the Chicago school is actually wrong. The biggest single critique I think that got the most traction of the old Chicago school of antitrust was, oh, that they're obsessed with prices, that they only focus on price effects. I actually think that's wrong. I am no defender of the Chicago school, but they did not make that claim. Instead, they said we should fixate on output, and that's been less well appreciated. But if you go back and read, the old founding fathers, Bork and Bowman, etc., they say in no uncertain terms, the only task for antitrust is to make sure that output's going up. If conduct causes output to go up, it must be good and therefore legal. If conduct causes output to go down, that's when it's bad, that's when it's illegal. And that idea, you can find it in the old Chicago school writings. You can find it in contemporaries, right? I think Herb Hovenkamp has kind of become the leading proponent of an output-only version of antitrust. It's certainly echoed by people that kind of orbit around George Mason. They filed an amicus brief in the Amex case back in 2018 that said this. But that's the idea, is antitrust is all about output. And if output's going up, we're all good. Okay, so in my paper, I tried to put together just a catalog of instances when output going up does not mean the world is a better place necessarily. And for just one example, There is a case, and this is also an example of how antitrust law doesn't reflect the idea that output is all that matters. You had a group of dentists in Indiana get together and say, you know what, we're not going to supply x-ray information to insurance companies. Insurance companies said, at least, that they were trying to get that information so that they could help make sure costs were appropriately low. Dentists said, we want to be doing the most expensive procedures possible. We don't want anybody second guessing that, so we're not going to give you this information. Supreme Court said, this is terrible. This is like per se illegal, essentially, what these dentists are doing. They're colluding. And what they're doing is driving output up, right? They're making more of their services happen than should in a competitive market. That's an example where there's an information asymmetry. And anytime that's true, the seller may be able to sell more than they should in a competitive market. So there's an example, but there's a whole bunch of others.
Yeah, well, the Supreme Court in the American Express decision, remember, just pointed to increased credit card transactions as proof that there couldn't have been anti-competitive effects. Of course, that ignored the counterfactual of how many transactions would have occurred absent the conduct. But I digress. I've since been to therapy, and I think I'm over that one. But let me tell you, I read The Economist this weekend, as I'm prone to do on Saturday mornings, and they had this line in defense of Facebook. Just want to read to you. They say. The idea that consumers have been poorly served by the social media market in recent years is hard to square with the hours of extra time they are devoting to it, end quote. That was a line from this week's Economist. Is that an example of the output welfare fallacy?
Yes. And Hal, let me first thank you for your service. Thank you for reading The Economist so the rest of us don't have to, because despite the name, they seem to be absolutely horrible economists. This is a perfect example. So one problem, there are like at least 3 or 4 with that single sentence. But one problem is what you just talked about with the Amex case. It ignores the counterfactual, right? You can't just look at output of a product going up and say, okay, no anti-competitive conduct occurred, right? We don't know what would have happened in the better world where Facebook wasn't out there buying up every competitor, right? So that's one problem. Second, it ignores the nature of this product itself, right? This is a product that can be and is designed to be addictive. You look at something like fentanyl consumption. Output has been going up when it comes to fentanyl. That does not mean consumer welfare is increasing, right? Same thing here, right? Just because time spent on the site is increasing does not mean that consumers are better off. It just might mean that the services become more addictive because of intentional design choices. So that's kind of problem number 2. And then problem number 3 is we know from the FTC's opening argument and from Meta's own, it sounds like internal studies, that the ad loads have been going up, which means you're seeing less content that you want to see at any given moment and more ads that you don't want to see. Well, if you want to get your fill of content, that means you got to spend more time on the site because you've got to wade through the ads to see the stuff you want to see. So I would expect time usage statistics to be going up, right? And that doesn't mean there's not a monopoly. It may actually mean there is a monopoly here.
Well, as you know, I agree with you about the output welfare distinction. You know, I've written about it as well, and even famously got an article removed from Pro Market for demonstrating even theoretically that welfare is not attached to output. But there's another problem with how output's being described here. Like there's some articles out there like Fiona Scott Morton talking about these addictive markets where output is problematic. But there's also a little shiftiness going on about what output is being attached to. So is it attached to welfare? In which case we know that the output does not necessarily increase welfare. Is it output for output's sake? And sometimes Hovenkamp goes to that realm when you push him on the problems of welfare, right? And so it seems like the problem is when you move away from the first notions of either consumer welfare, you know, total surplus trading partners, whatever you want to call it, you start to become untethered from anything that relates to welfare. And then why are we pursuing output in the first place? And Herb's answer is, well, because the Supreme Court says so. So how do you, I mean,
Yeah.
but that's untethered from this, as you point out, I mean, as well. I mean, that's untethered from what the statute even derives. So why pursue this what's the point behind pursuing output just for output's sake?
I will confess to some frustration uh, at what you described as kind of the shifting sands here. And it is tough when you're trying to engage in scholarly debate, which is, something that we all love to do. It's part of our jobs, right? It's kind of tough to engage in a rigorous debate when one side is constantly shifting its position. You end up talking past each other. It can get frustrating, I imagine, for everybody, including people looking on. Here's as best as I can diagnose the problem here. It's that people throw out words like output or welfare or consumer welfare, the consumer welfare standard, and they don't actually sit back and think in any kind of rigorous way about what they mean before tossing it around. You might be referring to any one of probably 5 or 6 different layers of antitrust as I think about it, right? At the very top layer, you've got the goal of antitrust. But below that, you've got whatever analytical framework we're going to use to try to get to that goal. Below that, you've got the actual metrics we might use in a given case using that framework to test against that goal. Below that, you might have sort of assumptions that we're going to make about the world because we don't know all the facts in any given case. You might be talking about that, and so on and so on. And people just say things like the consumer welfare standard. What they really mean is some kind of version of surplus as the goal. They mean, economics circa 1975 as the framework. They mean output as the only metric, right? So people use these terms without any kind of precision, and that's really frustrating. I think we could improve our debates a lot if people were more clear about whether they're talking about, like, is output the goal of antitrust? If so, that's a tough claim to make, right? You can go back and look at the text of the statute and what the legislature said about it. None of them said this is only about output. Maybe it's not a goal, maybe it's a metric in that case you run into all the problems that you and I have written about. I think that's kind of my diagnosis. There's just an imprecision in the way that people use these terms. I think that leads to some pretty frustrating discussions.
I think it also leads to a little bit of charlatanism. Like, consumer welfare doesn't mean what you think it means. It means what I think it means. And it means, total surplus, not consumer welfare. And we don't have this kind of discussion outside of IO and industrial organization. And other realms of economics, we know exactly what we mean. And then you see people trying to rebrand things like, let's not call it consumer welfare. Let's call it something else. And that leaves me my final question for you. There's this, there was this movement about changing how we view welfare from looking at GDP. And most welfare economists have moved away from surplus measures of welfare, except in antitrust. But as you probably saw, there's a book called Abundance that's out there. Have you read that book? And is it kind of just a rebranding of using GDP and deregulation? I'm asking leading questions today because that's just how I'm going to be today. But
no, I have not read it. I am not enough of a masochist to pick it up. I've read enough reviews to know that I think I disagree with what I take to be its fundamental premise, and that is that outputism, at least in a couple of sectors, is not just good for its own sake, but it's also like good politics. And that I just disagree with fundamentally. Who knows? Maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm not a political scientist. But as a national project, a political project, the idea that you're going to pitch people on like zoning reform to get more housing units built just seems laughable to me. I'm not even sure it's a good state level strategy, frankly. It's probably a good strategy in a few cities where housing abundance is a problem and maybe the biggest problem. That's not true of every city, right? It's certainly not true of every state, and it's not true of the country as a whole. We do have a housing affordability problem. I think that's different from zoning reform, right? I have not read the book in part because a few years back when I wrote a paper called The Myth of Free, I forced myself to read the previous generation of abundance books, which people have kind of memory hold and forgot about, but there was a whole slew of these things in like the 2000s. Chris Anderson had one called Free. There's literally one called Abundance that was written a few years before that. I read all of them, and all of them make the same fundamental mistake. They do this kind of utopianism that I think the new crop of authors do as well. And that's that they ignore the demand side of the equation, right? They think they make these predictions of future abundance, utopianism, and forget that technology is constantly shifting. So they think if we just build more nuclear reactors, we're going to have all this abundant electricity. It's going to be coming out our ears, right? It's going to be so cheap, it'll be free, basically. Well, we're pretty good at coming up with ways to use up resources. And I think if we build a whole bunch of nuclear reactors, I think we'll get even dumber ways to use that electricity than we have now. And right now, we're using it on like Studio Ghibli-ified family photos. And we're using it to solve meaningless math equations to mine cryptocurrency. That's in the current world. If it gets cheaper than that, we're going to just come up with even dumber ways to use up the resource. So just build, build, build it's, you know, great sounding, but it's not an answer to everything.
There's this one portion in there about zoning. You're right, and I'm laughing because their example is Houston, and because we don't have zoning. But you know, part of the reason we have so many houses is a lot of those houses are built in the flood zones. And so a lot of those houses flooded in previous hurricanes. So I don't know, that might just be temporary abundance, if anything else. So
It's a great example. You can't ignore the uses to which we put things. You have to be strategic and thoughtful about this. You can't just say, let's cut the red tape and let the floodgates go. That's just not going to be not going to be good.
And of course, my last comment is you're right. There is an abundance of abundance literature, and that kind of proves the point that abundance by itself is not necessarily good.
That's true.
Well, John, that was fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on the show. And hopefully our viewers will enjoy this and will help us digest the next week of the FTC trial. And who knows how things will turn out. But have a great week, and we'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.